It's now time for the Maclean's panel. I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for City News and Rogers Radio, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Aaron Wary, the Associate Editor for Maclean's, and we are joined by the Maclean's Ottawa Bureau Chief, John Geddes. Thanks for being here. All right, so we have two big stories that happened this week. We have On Baird's resignation, as well the NDP being ordered to pay back $2.75 million for the satellite offices that they had set up. But before we get to that, let's talk about the big story of the Supreme Court ruling on physician-assisted death. John, you were in the lockup for that. You've been talking to a number of people. Where do we go from here? What does the government do in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing people should know is this decision wasn't really a surprise. There was a fair amount of consensus of view that the Supreme Court was not going to allow the old blanket prohibition on physician-assisted suicide or physician-assisted medically assisted death. There's various phrases people use. They weren't going to let that stand. So lots of people braced for this. The interesting thing about this decision, people are comparing it to, for example, the Supreme Court striking down the prostitution laws last year, or year before last, I guess. And the difference is that in this case, the court pretty clearly signaled that they expect the decision or the solution to this problem, the vacuum of law, to be settled not just by the federal government, but also by the provinces, which have health as part of their jurisdiction, and the professional associations for doctors, so presumably the physicians, colleges, and the Canadian Medical Association. So this is quite a different scenario. It isn't just thrown right into the lap of the federal justice minister to deal with. There's a broad responsibility. Now, I think the federal government is going to like that. Much harder for them to have a fraught issue like this come straight to them, where they have to deal with it. They have to answer directly to their base, parts of which are not going to like a rule that allows doctors to participate in essentially ending the lives of their patients quickly. So this, I suspect what they'll do, and what the CMA is calling for, is some kind of broad task force to be named. People from both levels of government, people from the professional associations, and people representing patients, and I presume people representing people with disabilities. So if the federal government is shrewd about this, they may be able to spread the risk out in the next 12 months and prevent this from becoming something they have to grapple with alone.
So that sounds like it's not going to be dealt with anytime soon, at least not before the next election. Aaron, how would this play out in the next election?
I suspect my first impression, my first guess would be that, as John suggests, every party is kind of, I don't think there's any one party that wants to own this issue, that wants to be the party that comes down and says this is what we must do, because it's such a fraught issue, it's so complicated, it's so emotional. To me, the answer comes in not so much punting this, but in deferring, I guess, to either Parliament in sort of a multi-partisan setup, or to some sort of outside task force, as John suggests, that really takes a look at this and tries to find a consensus on the issue. I don't know that any of the parties have a clear win here politically, and I don't know whether even voters necessarily want to have a debate over this issue in the middle of an election. It's just so fraught, it's so emotional, it's so complicated that for all of the reasons, as Emmett McFarlane wrote for us today, the Parliament hasn't dealt with this, that has tried to kind of avoid the issue. I think that feeling still holds. I mean, the ball has been sort of put in Parliament's court to do something, but I think now Parliament is still in the same kind of spirit of like, I don't know, does anybody really want to own this issue and try to drive a solution here, or do we want to appeal to a kind of a multi-partisan, wider group to kind of try and find a solution here?
Sorry, go ahead, Carl.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the problems you run into politically on something like this is, even if you were to poll or survey in some way and decide, well, people are ready for some kind of well-regulated, tightly constrained system for doctors ending the lives of very seriously terminally ill people who are demonstrably suffering. Even if people would accept that as a majority, you still fear a sort of an activated minority, a group of people who, for reasons of conscience or religion, valid reasons, are never going to accept this. And you don't want to be the one who's the target of that determined minority's rage, right? You want to avoid that.
I also, sorry not to cut, I also don't know, just on the early indications, where, to take the Conservative Party, for instance, you have Stephen Fletcher saying, good, I'm glad this ruling has happened. You have a guy like Peter Kent saying, good. And then you have a couple other Conservative MPs saying, this is a terrible decision. even if, I don't know if there's one party here that is ever going to have unanimity on the issue.
No.
So what you're going to end up with is again, I think, so much conflict that there's going to be a need, an appeal to try to find some sort of multi-partisan effort here. I think it's interesting in that this comes at the same time as the national security issue, in that it sets up another test of Parliament and its ability to deal with these issues seriously and deal with these issues in a professional way. And on the national security front, I don't think we're going to get that professionalism because there are political gains to be made. On this issue, because there aren't political gains to be made, maybe we will actually get that professionalism.
And just to be clear, neither of you think that this will be a situation like abortion where they just put their hands up and say the courts have dealt with it and we're not going to jump into this?
Well, the court, in this case, the decision pretty clearly states that they expect not just Ottawa, and I'm coming back to this point, Carmack, not Ottawa, but also the provinces and medical professional associations to grapple with this. So the court having telegraphed, not just that it wants the federal parliament to deal with it, but provincial legislatures and others, very difficult for Ottawa to unilaterally say, no, we're not doing anything about this. Well, what if somebody else steps into the gap and says, oh, well, then we'll do something about it. There already are provinces who want to deal with this on their own. So it's a hard one to just put off in that way they did with abortion.
All right, so we're going to shift then to another big story. This week we were all surprised when Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird, now ex-Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird, announced that he would be resigning from cabinet and soon would be resigning as MP for Ottawa West Nepean. It was a surprising thing to learn of. I think it was Tuesday night. Were there any indications at all, looking back now, can you see any indications that he was not happy with where things were headed and wanted out of federal politics?
I think we've seen these reports that he had been thinking about this for months. I mean, I don't know if I don't think I can look back and say, oh, yes, I saw this coming. By the same token, John and I were having this conversation this week. Cabinet ministers resign eventually, like they aren't there forever. He'd been in federal and provincial politics for 20 years. He probably was at a job that he may never get a better job in government than he had right then. To me, there's all sorts of theorizing. Oh, was he pushed? Did he jump? Why is he leaving? To me, at the risk of being naive, it sort of makes sense that a guy at 45 would say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to go do another job for a while. We tend to get very shocked. I remember when Jim Prentice quit, we were all very shocked that he would quit. And then we all kind of get over it in a few days. I think we have to kind of be a bit reasonable about this and say that eventually these guys are going to leave. They aren't going to stay until they're 70 being cabinet ministers.
What difficulty does it leave, John, for the government moving forward? Within a year, Jim Flaherty left cabinet and then unfortunately later passed away. But then John Baird as well left cabinet. Two major figures from Ontario politics that were in the cabinet.
Well, one thing that it reminds us of, and I'm going to say this flat out, is the general weakness of the federal cabinet. This is not a particularly strong federal cabinet. I've covered several different regimes in Ottawa, and none of them have been perfect. You don't see a Camelot round table being assembled in the Langevin block here. But this cabinet has only a few pillars to it. You would say, for sure, Jason Kenney. Baird was one. Tony Clement has survived. I don't think he's a star political performer on the public stage, but he seems to be trusted to do a job. There are a couple of others you could have a debate about, but there aren't a lot of heavyweights in that cabinet. And so one thing we are seeing here is we're being reminded, why was there? Aaron mentioned there seemed to be almost a disproportionate level of interest in Baird leaving. I mean, it's a big story no matter what, but boy, we really focused on that. Why did we? Well, one reason is it's thin. If you look at the cabinet and think, who are the big names? It's thin. So a guy like Baird, a guy like Kenney, Prentice when he left, these guys really stand out because there's not a deep bench there. So that's part of the story. So the challenge for the Prime Minister going into this important election year is that he needs not just competent ministers, but ministers he can put out who are presentable and interesting to the public. So take, for example, Joe Oliver, his finance minister. Many people would say this veteran Bay Street investment banker is a good kind of guy to have as finance minister. Not many people would say he's a great communicator, And you could go down the list and say there are other people like that as well. John Baird, James Moore, Jason Kenney, these were guys, I would argue Rona Ambrose now, who sort of revived herself as a minister. These are people who are sort of legitimate big league politicians, but there aren't a lot of them. So you lose Baird. The first problem is you look around, who's your next guy to promote? Who's someone else who's proven that they deserve to go up a notch? It's hard to think of someone.
And then within the Conservative Party as well, Aaron, I mean, the criticism has always been that a lot of people, cabinet ministers and regular backbench MPs, take their orders and their marching orders from the PMO and just stick to their talking points. Baird was one of those voices that never really did that. He sort of blazed his own trail and did his own thing for a lot of this. What does that mean for the Conservative caucus and the Conservative Party to lose a person like Baird?
I think John's right. I think it hurts. It's funny. We get into these, every time there's a shuffle, every time there's a resignation, I think the interesting discussion to be had is what exactly does a cabinet minister do at this point? Like, are they driving policy? Are they driving communication? Are they major figures that seem to be doing something? This government, Conservatives are very keen to point to the Prime Minister and say, well, under the Prime Minister's leadership, we've done X. Under the Prime Minister's leadership, we've done Y. And that ends up leaving you going, well, what are all those other 40 ministers doing? I do think it is a loss. It is I think it is one more voice that they don't have. It's another chance to kind of wonder, oh, well, is this government starting to run out of steam? If they can find someone who will step up into cabinet and fill that role, they might be okay. But it doesn't. It's another drag on a government going into another election.
All right, now let's look at the opposition, the NDP. There was another big story this week, and the Board of Internal Economy ordering the New Democrats to pay back the $2.75 million that was spread out from the office budgets of 68 MPs on their side, and they all pitched in for these satellite offices. They're claiming right now that this is a kangaroo court, this is the pile-on, and they're really not happy with how this has gone. John, is this a legitimate issue that we should really be focused on, or should we believe the NDP that this is all just political and a pile-on from the Liberals and the Conservatives?
I don't know if I would use the word kangaroo court, because I'm not sure you can dignify the Board of Internal Economy with the word court. I mean, the Board of Internal Economy is not a court of any sort. It's a closed door, it's just a ridiculous institution. We have this incredibly secretive, arcane group doing this. Is the complaint about what the NDP did with their budget legitimate? It might be. It looks like to me like they were pretty creative with the way they funded those satellite offices. On the other hand, were there clear rules in place? Has there been fair adjudication of what other parties have done? We have no way of knowing that, because that is not a court, kangaroo otherwise. It's a star chamber that we have no way of looking into. We don't know what evidence they've considered. It doesn't appear like they talked to the MPs who are actually directly involved in this case. I don't know. From the outside, I think the process is, to the degree that I'm sympathetic with the NDP on this, it's because the process seems terrible. And that is stipulating that they may have done something wrong. They very well may have done something wrong here. But boy, as an outsider, and I mean journalists, any voter who cares to pay attention to this issue, wants to try to sort it out, good luck to you, because that process is closed. It is a black box. And I just think it's ridiculous we still have that in the heart of the management of the House of Commons. We have this ridiculous institution.
So let's talk about the voters who are not as in tune with...
there are many who are very in tune with the Board of Internal Economy.
Yeah.
You know, lots of our listeners will have the minutes and they'll be dealing with that. Yeah.
It's a huge budget issue.
But I mean, the voters who don't pay that much attention to politics, what they saw on the television screens or heard on the radio this week were a lot of NDP MPs walking by, not answering questions about paying back the money, and then some lines just saying, well, no, it's all them, it's not us, we didn't do anything wrong. Is the public perception on this a negative for the NDP right now moving forward?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think I have a certain amount of sympathy for them in that their complaint that these are the Conservatives and the Liberals passing judgment on them.
Which is true.
It's true. I mean, you can't really get around that. But yeah, it doesn't help to have that hanging over your head. And if you want to be the party poking the government and saying, you're unethical, you're abusing public funds, it doesn't help if they can come back and go, well, what about the $2.75 million? To how much that's going to actually matter in the long run, I don't know. I think a lot of times the public sort of just looks at this and goes, this is politicians being jerks and they're crooks and we can't trust them, and it's all this noise and bickering. I think there is an opening here for someone or some party to say, we're going to have major reform of how resources are spent on the Hill in terms of mail-outs, in terms of office budgets. We're going to cut down on the amount of money that is spent for strictly partisan purposes. and that would go, even as far as the way the government has used their advertising budgets. So maybe that's where this goes from here. Otherwise, I think it's a bit of a thorn in the side of the NDP, but otherwise, I suspect it just gets sort of lumped in with the way this parliament has been in its sort of not greatest moments.
Yeah, and there's a lot of apathy right now, and also it's a very inside baseball story. I
Sure
mean,
is.
a lot of people just arguing over the definition of where you can actually have an office
and
or not.
Cormac, these kinds of issues that involve public money, where they start to where people start to worry about them is when it seems like someone has pocketed that public money, right? That's where people really start to worry. In this case, although the NDP, as I say, may have been quite creative in the way they used their budget, they used it for running party offices. There's no doubt about that. Nobody pocketed it. Nobody ran off with funds. Or, there wasn't any of that kind of stuff. And it's still quite a bit removed from the worst kind of money scandal where I think voters really do get concerned.
All right, we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out, and in court as well with the NDP fighting this. So thank you very much, John Geddes, the Maclean's Ottawa Bureau Chief, Aaron Wary, Maclean's Associate Editor and co-host, and I'm Cormac McSweeney, Parliament Hill Bureau Chief for City News and Rogers Radio.